Hello everyone, I'm Teal.
And I'm Teal.
Hello Studio Blue.
Thank you for joining us for the Blue Room.
All right, tonight we are going to have a really good conversation. We got two wonderful guests. Go ahead and introduce yourselves. We got KeyMountainGamer and Arcfinder. Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
I am KeyMountainGamer. I've done a couple of these already, so some of you may already know who I am. Been in the indie development scene for a little bit. Haven't officially published anything yet, but I do feel I'm a bit knowledgeable about RPG Maker software itself. I do get a lot of people ask me questions, and I try to help out as much as I can. So yeah, always glad to be here. Liked writing stories, so.
My name is Ark. I am relatively new to the RPG Maker community, but sort of a long-time lurker. I'm sort of from a film and television background, and my specialization, I suppose, was in writing and directing. I'm working on a game called Eternal Remnant at the moment, which is sort of a narrative-driven RPG.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we've played Eternal Remnant on the RPG Maker web channel. Please feel free to take a look at that. If someone would like to pop that link into the chat, I can pop it into the description when the stream is over. It was a good LP, great game. Go ahead and support it. All right, so we got a bunch of people here tonight. Do we want to give a hello, Teal, to our arrivals and the people watching us as we start?
Well, sure. We have KV, Laufey, we have Wolfie, Bell Shell, and Mela. The Thirst. I like that, Mela. That's a good one. Not Very Soft, and a whole bunch of other folks.
Yes. If you're lurking, feel free to lurk. If you want to participate at any point, we're monitoring chat. We'll be happy to answer your questions. Okay, tonight we are talking about the structuring of your game's story. We've gone over in depth, and many times we've gone over things such as, outlining your story, creating, your base storyline, your side storylines, how to do your story beats, how the flow of a narrative goes with, the beginning, the old status quo, the rising action, with all of its complications, the try, fail, succeed cycle, the climax, the denouement. We've talked about all of that, and of course, ending in the new status quo. We've talked about different aspects of finding those story beats, those different aspects of, when to be restrictive versus when to right by the seat of your pants. But now we're going to talk with our panel of guests here on their ways of structuring your game's story. As always, our topics are broad, on purpose, so that we can just have this organic discussion on it. So first I want to start off with this. When I say structuring a game's story, what I think of is creating the actual main story itself and how it goes from old status quo to new status quo, but maybe our guests have different definitions. Maybe they want to expand upon that. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. What do you all think about the actual art of structuring a game story?
I can take this one if you want.
Go ahead.
I'm kind of a big proponent of. I don't know if there is a definitive way to structure a story.
I don't think there is.
And I just think there are a lot of ways you can do it, and then there are some which we've seen kind of appeal to more people and seem to have bigger resonance with people. And there are others that might be more niche, but have audiences of their own as well. I personally like to start with traditional 3-act structure, which has been almost around as long as humans have kind of existed.
True story.
And it gets reinvented every now and then, but I think for me it's just a comfortable, easy place to start, and then you can get you can see where it goes. You can project forward and think, well, is this going to line up with what I want later? And you can start to mesh these kind of pieces together and experiment with them in a way that's fun to. Obviously, the intent is for it to be fun to watch, or fun to play, or fun to read. But you also want to have fun writing it as well.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
What do you think?
Definitely.
What do you think, KeyMountain?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to structuring a video game story, I'm very much in Arc's camp. It's very difficult to really define the best ways to do it because there really isn't an objectively best way. There is a best way depending on the writer, of course. You have to really know your writing strengths and what kind of stories you want to tell, plus what kind of game you're really trying to make, and how that story how it plays into it. Is it the core of your game, or does it help define the mechanics of it? All those things I think are good to lay out and know ahead of time, if you care about adding story in. Luckily with video games, especially what's established in most general public, they don't associate video games as needing a story. Everyone has different opinions on that, of course, but luckily the general audience aren't really fully story focused. So I feel like video game structure, when you're talking about trying to structure your story, that you can kind of experiment a lot more than you could than with something like a play or a book or something, because you can afford to be a lot more experimental with it. I think just because gameplay is more about video games are more about the gameplay, and you can make it about the story, but you can also play with story structure because it's a video game more so than you could with any other medium.
Well, I agree on that. You definitely want to consider the fact that if it's a game, there has to be a gameplay element. Otherwise, it's more like a visual novel or interactive movie, which, while valid, is very different. What do you think, Teal? Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I pretty much agree with the points that Arc and KeyMountainGamer have brought up. I really feel that you should keep it kind of loose, and the focus is on gameplay rather than sitting there reading a visual novel, unless you're actually going to be programming a visual novel. It really is about the experience, getting in there and doing and being. So I guess if you're structuring a story, which that's not really my forte, so I'm gonna leave it up to you guys. But I mean, just from somebody, kind of approaching it from a different, I guess, direction. As long as there's something for the player to do and learn, kind of a journey, that's cool. As Belle pointed out, Belle on a chat, it starts their game with the hero's journey, and that's always a great place to start.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
it's definitely one of the more common stories that game makers like to tell. Especially when you talk about your RPGs, the hero's journey is I don't want to call it a trope, but it's something most often used. In my experience, even games that aren't necessarily a hero's journey will have elements of that, because the hero's journey is basically just over the course of the story, the quote-unquote hero is growing and is learning, whether it be about themselves or about the people around them or whatnot. So I do think that it's a good fallback, and it's a good place to start, and you're going to probably find elements of that in your game no matter what. I do want to mention, if I may, something that KeyMountain talked about, where he said some games don't have a story. While that is technically correct in the sense that you won't have a story where character gets up, character goes and saves the world, every game does have something that it's telling. I mean, even Pac-Man, the story is the yellow wedge is going around eating dots and is trying to avoid the ghosts. So while I'm not disagreeing with you, I think we need to make sure that as developers, we don't get trapped into the mindset of, oh, my game doesn't have a story because it's all action. There's still something happening, and that something is motivating the player to play, even if it's just moving a pie wedge around a maze.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at some point you do start grasping a little bit more, though. Like, the story of Tetris, technically you could make one, but you're stretching at that point.
Right.
Or Pong, or, I mean, even, it's so a little bit more of an interesting, I guess, thing is that for me, something like the Elder Scrolls series is another thing where it's hard to talk about what is the story, because the story is told by the player and their actions. While there is a background narrative, there is a main quest, and one can argue that is the story, almost anyone who actually plays anything from Elder Scrolls, Daggerfall, Oblivion, Skyrim will tell you that their experience from playing those games isn't actually the story itself. It was their own personal narrative journey. Mm-hmm. So the story of Skyrim or the Elder Scrolls series isn't important because all that matters is what the player tells. So while it does have a story, I sometimes argue that it doesn't really have one because that's not really the main focus of it anyway.
Well,
it's a backdrop.
As someone who literally lives in Skyrim VR, I agree with you. Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So like, and that's I think is an interesting thing that you can do with games is that you can lay down the foundation to tell a story, but then you can leave it up to the player to decide do they even want to follow that story or not. And that is a very difficult game to design. It's incredibly difficult to design, but when you can do it, it's really interesting. And that's one thing I will give like the Elder Scrolls series a lot of credit for. They do capture that feeling.
You were saying, Ark?
Sorry. No, I really like how I really like that line of discussion, KeyMountain, because I happened to be watching a GDC talk, which was definitely not in preparation of this stream about game structure. One of the points they raise is that like some of the more popular games like Elder Scrolls and those open world sorts of games with these like rich stories and these billion quest lines and all these different sort of story driven things or character driven things that you can do, is that people there is no linear experience of these games, and that sort of goes in the face of goes against the idea of like conventional structure and that kind of thing. And a common question raised is like, why do people hold these games in such high regard when we talk about story, in spite of the fact that they're kind of just doing whatever they want? I think the obvious answer is that you're creating the story yourself. Like you're the most immediate participant in that type of story, and it's just a different way of experiencing something, and it's one that you really just craft out yourself, as opposed to being along for the ride in a Final Fantasy or something like that.
Well, and I agree with that, and I would say that in some regards, the current paradigm has shifted over time from highly narrative linearity to more what you're talking about. And nowadays, I think because there's been so many narrative-driven games, the bar has been set extremely high for what is considered to be a good linear narrative game. And if it doesn't have that, then I think that players want more and more that desire to feel that they're influencing the story instead of just experiencing it. And I think we are seeing a shift away from that. We're seeing a shift away from I'm just experiencing to I'm influencing. You know, it kind of started with, hey, I get a multiple choice during this scene. Do I say it this, or do I say this, or do I say this? And there's a change in how the NPCs react. And over time, a little bit more of that freedom's been added, and now it's at the point where players like yourself, like you're talking about, players get to actually craft their own kind of story, their own narrative. And people like that freedom.
Yeah, I do. And it's also interesting when you have a story that's planned out, and then the way you design your game is you want the players to discover what the story is. Obviously, to talk about more, I guess, recent games that are more relevant are things like the Five Nights at Freddy's series or the Dark Souls, the Soulsborne series. Those games, they don't have a story up front. You have to dig, you have to search, you have to dig deeper, and as you do so, it's the community that ends up telling the story, not the game itself. It has the foundation, it has the clues, it drops the hints, but ultimately, there's no dialogue in the game that actually ends up telling you the story, really ever. Maybe a few item descriptions that hint at things, but then the people who actually end up telling the stories are streamers or YouTubers who then make channels, and they're like, and they tell the story for you. And it's interesting that you can craft games like that as well. And to know that, again, when it comes to your video game, you don't need to force feed information to the player. As long as the elements are there and you can hint at enough, sometimes it actually creates a community around your game, because they'll sit there and because they want to figure it out. People love discovering things. They love figuring things out, puzzling things together over like what's happening. So whether it's crafting their own narrative or whether it's trying to craft your narrative, it can add a lot of interesting fun to a player. if you're going to have a linear experience, you better really have your storytelling down really well, because you can lose people if it doesn't resonate with them, if it's not interesting, if you miss your story beats. You can kind of cop out a little bit with video games because you can just say, I'll let the gamers do it for me.
Well,
you don't be lazy about it, because they'll pick up on if you're lazy about it.
Also, and go ahead and turn it over to everyone else in a second. It reminds me of the old adage: once you give access to your player base, access to your lore, you've already given away the ability for you to say that's your lore. Look at the Elder Scrolls, a great example. Yeah. We know the Elder Scrolls lore. They've published pages of it, books in and out of the games, and yet the player base still will come up with their own interpretation of what really is. And sometimes it's very fandomish, but sometimes it's very well thought out. I've seen articles about Chim, which if you've ever played Elder Scrolls, you know what the concept of Chim is, that have blown my mind, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not what Bethesda's intending, but holy crap. So once that lore is out there, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to your player base.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely so. And sometimes if you do try to take control of the story again, you have to do so very, very carefully, because you could upset the player base. I mean, we got to see a lot of that with the Legend of Zelda fandom, like you know, the Legend of Zelda timeline, trying to figure that out. It's silly. It was so silly, but we loved trying to figure it out because it was interesting, all the different ideas. And then Nintendo released their official version, and it made a lot of people upset.
I enjoyed watching the Kingdom Hearts fandom theorizing after the first game, Chain of Memories, and the second game. And just watching as all that theorizing was completely invalidated, but at the same time, it didn't matter. They liked trying. It was like watching a bunch of people try to figure out the plot of a movie as it's going on. You know, who's the killer? What's the big twist? And the Kingdom Hearts storyline is a Gordian knot, but it was fun to watch the engagement of the community. And I think that's a thing that I want to kind of push in that direction of, are you really writing the game for your game? Or are you really writing the game for the community, the player base? I think to them, being the consumers, they're the ones who you're really writing for. What do y'all think?
I mean, a lot of times, as Mela points out, the players are the ones who will make the connections. You as the storyteller, the one who's crafting the game, may not even have realized some connection or something that you put out there, but your players will pick up on it, and it becomes something for them.
I have an anecdote for that exact thing. There was a stream of my demo recently where there's one. I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want to seem less credible as a writer, but there's one scene in particular I was having a little bit of trouble with, and it just never felt quite right, or maybe it was less it felt quite right, but more I didn't understand the full inference of what was going on. And I knew it was I knew there was something there, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And there was a streamer who played it, and with that exact scene, took an interpretation from it, and I just thought, oh yeah, that's it, that's what happens. So I think there's a really good lesson there, is that you shouldn't underestimate like how plugged into your content that your audience is, because they can really add value to a story in that regard.
I agree completely, both with the things that I've written that have nothing to do with games, the books that I've written, as well as game stuff. Anytime I've written anything, if the player base or the reader base or whatever, if the consumer has gone in a direction that I might not even considered, many times that direction is actually better than what I was intending. And I may have been stuck like you're talking about, and then suddenly I'm like, holy shit, that's a really good idea. I'm stealing it. I'm using it. Yes, that's what I intended all along. I mean, you get to pull that moment, that kind of buff and look at your nails. But at the same time, you're like, holy crap, this person just added value to my product, to my story, that I never even would have considered. It's really a good feeling, actually. It's a good feeling.
Yeah. And it's even more interesting when you actually do that, because you also, if you do it well, you can make it feel like as if you're rewarding your audience, because they're like, hey guys, we figured it out. It turns out we were right. And so you give them a big win, and you get a big win. It's like, hey, not going to say that you guys wrote that part for me, but thank you. Thank you for saying I'm a genius. Yes, I am. I am playing 4D, 5D chess here, all things.
It's the whole buff. Yes, I intended it all along. But the thing is then they feel smart, and they're more invested, and it's not a trickery, because in a reality they have given you something. So it is a symbiotic give and take relationship at that point, where you're giving to them and they're giving to you. And I think that is one of the most fulfilling things about being a writer in general, is the whole back and forth that goes between you and your readers.
Yeah, well, I think in order to just be a good writer in general, you have to be able to take feedback. And I mean, whether it's 100,000 people online or whether it's just 3 people you know in your life, it's good to share your story with and see what insights do they have. Because if you want to write a story 100% by yourself, unfortunately there are going to be problems with it. There are going to be flaws, there are going to be pitfalls, there are going to be things that maybe you mixed up the continuity, because as writers we can get so invested. We can get so invested in the story, and especially since we're making a video game on top of that, if you're talking about video games, then people are worried about the assets used, the map design, or we're writing screenplays, we're worrying about the costumes, we're worrying about so many elements, and at that point we're not focusing on the story. So having someone go through, read it, experience it, and give feedback is what helps to rein it in. So I always tell people that it's a tool to go ahead, and if you're really stuck, let someone play test, let someone read your writing, let someone critique it, and that's a tool that every good writer should use.
I do want to, if I may, I want to quickly just kind of talk to chat for a moment. Everyone in chat is coming up with great thoughts and great ideas, and I want you to know that on a whole, things like internal and external conflicts, not necessarily expecting what comes of your writing, differentiating between world and lore, these are all things that a writer has to think about. A lot of times people will make comment during these, whether it be something like this or a panel at a convention, and writers who are sitting there are going, It's not one thing that you have to consider. There's a plethora of factors that have to be considered, and it all kind of starts melding into this miasma. But there is a structure to that creation, and that's where I kind of want to move this conversation. What type of structure do you all like to follow when you're crafting something, whether it be the entire story's narrative, the entire story, or individual scenes? What do you need? You've got to keep all these different things in your mind. What do you like to do in order to make sure there's some element of organization, so you're not just doodling whatever immediately comes to mind? Any one of y'all can start.
I know that for me, what I tend to do is, especially since, we are talking about game design, and it's just story structure in general, but to go more into the game story structure itself, I like to really understand, I guess, how I want the story to unfold to the player, and then from there I decide a different structure. So I have different structures that I have. I have like stories I tell that are choice-based, stories that are that maybe change as you replay the game, or stories that it's just a straight linear thing. But I first need to determine what's the best way to communicate this story to my audience. And video games are such an expressive medium that I think in order to really narrow down the best structures to use, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is you need to understand like what is your game really trying to be, and establish a structure early on. So if you know you want a lot of player interaction, a lot of player influence on the game, I really like having a lot of choices, either like actual literal choice branches or even more subtle choices. Some people who have playtested my projects will know that I sometimes even have certain events occur because you have a certain party member in your party, or because they're equipping a certain item that someone might comment on. It's like, you put on knight's armor, they're like, oh, you're a knight? It's like, no, I just found this at a shop. It's like, oh, I thought you were a knight. But it creates this rumor sort of thing that this person's going around, they're a knight or something. And it makes, those little things can really help add a lot of elements. I always like adding in elements to reward the player for the ingenuity. I think your story should be flexible enough to account for that, but that's just my own opinion. I love making really complex storytelling, layering events. That way, every time someone plays a game, they have something to talk about to their friends of like, hey, this is what happened in my playthrough. And like, oh, how did you get that dialogue? And that's really makes it fun, because it all comes down to the players. The players like to talk to each other. They like to share. I feel like your story in a game should be structured as such that it's fun to share. It's fun to talk about. If you have your game be so focused on one linear point, the conversation can end up going dry. Where it's just like, if people who played the game already know the story, you don't need to talk about it. And people who haven't played the game, you explain the whole story to them, and now they don't need to play the game. So
yeah.
And again, there's so many different layers to that. So I guess the way I kind of boil down that miasma is to first figure out, like, well, first, I want my game story to be dynamic. I don't want it to be something that is easily told when two people are sitting down and talking about the game. They're having a hard time really trying to figure out, like, they can't just explain the whole game right then and not give a player a reason to play it.
Okay.
At least when it comes to the story part. Obviously, gameplay, there's always reason to play games because of gameplay. But when it comes to the story, I want it to be where someone's just like, look, this is the story I experienced, but you really need to play the game. And then after you play the game, tell me what you experienced. And so that's how I tend to craft my story structures, are
Arcfinder,
adding an element.
Arcfinder, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think that with what Key Mountain was kind of describing reminds me of the film Donnie Darko, if you've seen it. Like,
yes,
one person can watch that film and have a certain experience, and then another person can watch that film and come away with a completely different meaning, which is a very cool way to present a series of ideas. In my case, I guess I can kind of speaking it from like a holistic kind of story perspective. My thing is, like, as long as I can see the Russian doll kind of top-down level view of stuff, I can get to a scene and know where the scene needs to start and where the scene needs to end and what information we need to learn in between. And if I know those things, I can stop panicking about how it fits into the overall story and what this line might foreshadow for later on, or what this line of dialogue might mean. I can just kind of free flow write that scene until I get to a point where I like it, and then I can go back from the macro view and go, okay, now does everything in this scene coincide with what happens in this blueprint?
Right. Does this fit? Yeah.
Does this fit? Yeah. And then the other tool I like to do is after I've got to that point, maybe I've got a sequence of gameplay, and maybe I've got a sequence of gameplay scene. I like to play through it because I do have an overall plan of what I want to happen, but sometimes what you write down on paper isn't where your story should just end up going. Sometimes you don't realize it, but you're writing something different. So if I play the first half an hour and I think it was going in another direction, I might find actually it's not going in that direction. It feels like this should happen next. And often I'll prioritize where it feels the story should go, and then I will go back to the drawing board in terms of the overarching narrative and see how it's going to fit. And often, like, your brain will build these connections anyway. So you might like a feeling or a vibe might lead you to choose a particular narrative moment, and you go with that. But your brain's making connections about things you plan, so you might not have had all the answers anyway. And suddenly something you come across when you're writing, you're like, oh, that actually fits with this thing that I wanted to happen later on.
Yes.
And that's why I like to sort of not so much now, because I'm approaching the end of my development for the first part of my for Eternal Remnant, but I used to play it all the time. I used to so does this part feel cohesive with the next part, and does this part feel like it should lead on to the next part? I just play it, watch scenes over and over again, and try and get a real sense of direction for where everything should go.
Yeah, I do want to say that what you were talking about, where as you're writing, suddenly you see yourself going in a potentially different direction or filling in a blank you didn't even know you had. I think every writer after a while has experienced that, and I think that is that little voice you've got to listen to. I can't even tell you the number of times that's happened to me, where I've had my outline, and my outline has said, whether it be, doesn't matter what it is, medium is irrelevant, or it said, first A, then B, then C, then D, and I'm like, well, I'm not 100% sure how D is going to get into the E point, and then when I get to C, I start writing something, and something just comes out. The characters just speak.
Yeah.
They talk through you. The scene comes through you, and then you're like, that's exactly what I need to do to get to E. Let me start laying it in, and sometimes you got to go back. Almost all the time you got to go back and do some revisions, but then suddenly your writing has written for you, and I think that right there is the hallmark, in my opinion, of a good writer, regardless of the medium, because you don't get so strict that you don't let the story speak through you.
And I think like one thing you can do to mitigate, because when we're talking about video games, there's, if you have to make any revisions to a scene, that's not great, because you have to go and undo a whole bunch of eventing or coding or whatever.
Right.
So one thing that can definitely get you there is just just having your script complete.
Yes.
For one.
Yes.
And that sounds like, that sounds obvious, but it's kind of tempting to sort of get 80% of the way there and think, oh yeah, I got it now. But it's really good to have that complete. Especially I find since I've moved over to working on a game, that's important.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
But even then, sometimes you make a scene and it's just not right. You've got to make that really tough decision and go, or a piece of gameplay and go, like, this doesn't fit. I really need to cut it, and it sucks because I put a lot of work into it, but it needs to be cut or it needs to be changed to get the best product possible. And you're not going to be able to do that every time, but
Well, I mean,
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, say on chat, someone's Doc Keithy says outline draft polish. Outline draft polish. The fact of the matter is you're going to revise no matter what. Whether you're revising in a game script, which you should do. You should always make your script ahead of time and revise the heck out of that, and then later on do the revisions through that more, so that you revise in the game engine less. That is a very good practice to follow. But also just be ready to revise that game script, whether it be a dialogue, a scene, the way something flows, even as something as the narrative through a dungeon. Be ready to revise it. And I think the more willing you are to cut, as painful as that is, to cut something, the more willing you are to say, okay, this entire scene isn't working, I'm going to scrap it and all of the different character movements and animations. It all goes away, and I'm going to start from the drawing board. And the more willing you as a developer are to do that, I think the more legitimate your final product is going to be, because this isn't working. It's got to go.
Yeah.
And it's an important realization for a lot of people, because you have to, as my old writing teacher told me, he said, you have to kill your darlings. And sometimes to add pace or to make your story more cohesive, you have to cut the stuff that you really like, and that's a tough thing to do, but you absolutely have to.
My publisher once told me, if you're not willing to scrap your entire manuscript because it's just not working and start over, you're not ready to write a book. And I think that's true. I don't mean be that extreme, but you have to have that mindset is at any point I have to go, this isn't working, let's start over. And it never gets to that point, hopefully, but you have to have that in you. Let's kill it, let's get rid of it. Okay, boom, let's make something that actually works.
Yeah. And especially if you have to redo entire scenes, like especially when it comes to game coding, it can be so discouraging to be like, but I put so much time and effort into it. Or it can even be even more discouraging when you put in a bunch of time and effort into it, and someone's just like, I just wish their lips moved when they talked. And you're like, why? Why would you? Why do you want this? Why? And sometimes there's a bit of a you run into that a lot as a developer. Sometimes you want something cool to happen, or your audience wants something cool to happen, and it's tedious. And you sit there and it's like, oh my gosh, it's going to take so much time and effort, and I don't have to do that. And what I usually tell people, it's like, well, do it, and then take a break, walk away, and when you come back and you play again, you probably will like what you see. It's like, oh my gosh, I remember, like, that it works now.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the more times you do that, the less tedious it begins to become, because you know how to do it. You've done this before. It's like, yeah, I've had to redo the entire move route because I changed the size of the map. Let me go back through. It's tedious the first 10 times. It will be. But after a fashion, you do it enough times, it doesn't feel tedious anymore. You start to feel excited because you feel like you're improving the scene. You're not worried about the tedium of it. You're not worried about
And also, you know it's coming, so you know it's coming after it happens a couple of times. So like you've probably put in like a measure or two just to make your life a little bit easier when that happens.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't make it any less fun. Revisions themselves are the work of any kind of anything. Revisions are the work.
Yes.
But it's while you're doing those revisions, you start seeing the final product come and start to form. And that, I think, is to me just the biggest reward for the work that revising takes. Because I'm like, holy crap, it's coming together. And then when I hit play, and I play that scene out, and I see it playing, and I'm like, damn, that's cool. You know? And pat yourself on the back. Feel good about it.
Oh, yeah. Definitely don't.
So,
you know.
Good.
I have something I wanted to bring up. Not Very Soft has a really good point, and I've often thought about this. Game difficulty. You know, a lot of us like to play on hard mode and nightmare mode, but at what point does your story get affected by that? Such as maybe elements of your story just don't come out because the player can't get past a certain point in nightmare mode, or things happen in the story that can only be seen if you're in a harder mode. I mean, what do you think about that?
Good question.
I know, for me,
go ahead. Question.
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead, guys.
Yeah, for me, I always think that difficulty in a video game, will almost assuredly affect your narrative in some fashion, whether there's an easy mode, a hard mode, a normal mode, whatever. It always affects how the player experiences the story. It affects the pace. It's like, depending on difficulty, people will move through your game differently. They'll experience the game differently. It will affect your story one way or another. It doesn't really matter at what point. I think for me, it matters how you integrate it. I think there's an established thing where a lot of players will be able to look through a difficulty list and be able to tell whether you accounted for difficulty in your story or not. Whether it's just literally, they just put this in here to make it harder for me. That's all it is. Or they put this in on purpose. I do enjoy a lot more when games have the difficulty be purposeful. I do enjoy it when harder difficulties reward not necessarily the true story or more story, but I like it when a difficulty can affect some of the commentary. Like, it wasn't technically intended, but it was like in one of the, for which Tales of was it? I don't remember which Tales of it was. But there's a Tales of game that, there was a boss that was incredibly hard to beat, but obviously if you lower the difficulty, you could beat them. And when you beat that boss, the character's comment is like, wow, that boss was a lot easier than I thought he was going to be. And then you end up, and then the big bad comes down and knocks your team down anyway, and so you end up losing. But if you play on a harder difficulty, you get wiped by the boss, so then it's supposed to be a boss fight you normally lose, and the character's like, he's too strong. How are we supposed to beat him? And the game continues anyway. It's like, ultimately, players lose, bad guy gets the power and moves on, but it was nice that's like, whether you were a super skilled person, you managed to beat the boss on the hardest difficulty, or whether you're just playing on easy, you at least got a scene that was like, wow, I actually thought he put up more of a fight than that. Like, it was just, it's interesting when you can have that exist.
The first Yggdrasil fight, or one of the Yggdrasil fights in Tales of Symphonia, you can beat him, although you're only causing 1 damage per hit, and it will take a very long time. And if you do, when you hit him, he mentions your perseverance. You know, he's pissed at you, but he mentions your perseverance. So the game does actually acknowledge what you've done in a narrative way. The game that I've been really heavily diving into how it works mechanically, because I want to learn from Toby Fox's Undertale, the game continues to have narrative and story development during the fights. Like the very first boss fight, Toriel, when she's pleading at Frisk to not leave, one of her attacks actually is tears. And it's like you can see it on either side of the screen. And all you got to do to dodge is just stand right in the center. But it's narrative. And all of the boss fights in Undertale are like that. So you don't have to feel restricted to just a cutscene or a cinema where the player has no control to being part of your story and its writing. And I think we're seeing more and more developers breaking away from just gameplay, story, and they're melding the two together. And I think that's necessary. I think that's a natural evolution of stories in video games, and more developers should do that.
Yeah, and more RPGs should do that as well, because historically it's not always easy for the kinds of stories that RPGs tell to incorporate those into mechanics. Like it can be quite difficult. Oftentimes it's just a given that a character can just suddenly use fire magic, and we all just kind of accept it. And yeah, but there do seem to be certain affordances in video game writing, which if you stop and think about, are kind of funny. And I think that RPGs, like mainstream RPGs, for quite a while have been using these affordances, but we could probably do some more creative things with them. An example of this is like, stop me if I'm being tangential, but there's an example with an FF7R, which I've just started playing on a train. This was yesterday, and I thought this is a great point to bring up, is you've got Avalanche, spoiler alert, who have just destroyed this micro reactor at the start of the game.
Okay, yeah, right.
And they're on a train, and there are people, wondering about who did this horrible act. And you've got a guy standing there with a machine gun on his arm, another guy with a massive sword on his back, talking about how Shinra are terrible in destroying the planet and how destroying the micro reactor was a good thing. And nobody kind of like joins these dots. And I just thought that's really emblematic of RPG storytelling. Like, we have some really obvious stuff that we just accept, and it's okay because it's in a game world.
Right.
And we just kind of move past it. But I wonder if we're going to see more and more sort of clever ways of getting around that sort of thing in games as we keep going forward.
I certainly hope so. And it's interesting that you bring up that particular sequence in FF7 Remake, which we have played to completion, online actually, on Twitch.
Nice.
That sequence has the middle manager guy, who's very pro Shinra, and we actually acknowledge that's one of our favorite background characters, because he's just a dude. This is his job. This is what he relies upon to live. And at the end of that sequence, when people are getting off the train, they show him greeting his wife and children. And it's to juxtapose, you are fighting for this planet, yet this one moment where this guy sits down, he gets on one knee, and he hugs his kids, and his wife hugs him, and that you're destroying this man's livelihood. Is your motivation and your methodology truly pure? Or are you just as much of a villain as Shinra is? And while it does not go on the whole idea of big guy with a sword being sus, it does show that the writers of FF7 Remake were trying to go, this is a story about people, not just a big guy with a sword beating a pretty boy with mommy issues.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example of like thematic construction, which has been well thought out. And we just want less stuff to take us out of the moment, so we can focus on that stuff. And I think the construct. I noticed that when I got off the train, I thought, that's nice, right? And a lot of people won't catch that because they're just kind of flying through the level or whatever. But it is a nice little touch, and little touches like that are great.
You will see many more of them. If you've just started playing FF7R for the first time, you will see many more. And I think that's a very...
I'm currently doing about 60 billion cat side quests, so right after those,
But
relatable.
But that's a very good game to talk about how they use little moments to build up the world itself. And I think that's a good segue into what may be one of our last topics, is going outside of the norm of just writing just for your protagonists, antagonists, and tritagonists. I think you have to give just as much to the background. They may not get the volume of words and the volume of treatment, but a background character or background characters or events should not be given any less credence and priority than my arm floating away than the main narrative. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I mean, atmosphere and the background, that is something that, there's a lot of games that people play that I'm sure that kind of lack it. And for the most part, your general audience, they say they don't care. They say that, hey, I come home from work, I just want to mash some buttons and go back to sleep. But there is something to be said about actually putting in that effort. It's like, it does make your game world breathe a little bit more. And you never know, there could be those few people that do come home from work and they start mashing buttons away, and that's where they start noticing it's like, I never noticed that the NPCs, like when I come by with like my guns blazing, they duck and cover. It's like makes sense. Or how like characters in the background of like Street Fighter, how they'll react to certain combos, or at least in older Street Fighters. I know some of them it's not so much, but it was kind of cool how back then they would actually like react a little bit more to certain things. Like you don't have to include that necessarily. I mean, for most people, they're sitting there, they're playing a fighting game. They don't need the background to react, but if you throw that in there, it gives something fun to do for the people that find it monotonous. It adds more life, it adds more character, and it can, in fact, tell more of a story because of it. I like working on NPC dialogue as well because of that. You never know what kind of extra layers of story you can add by working on your NPCs, whether they have text boxes or whether they have move routes that just looks like they go day to day.
Emoticons.
Yeah, exactly.
Teal, Arc, what do y'all think?
I really like the playing with an NPC's route. I just piggybacking on what KeyMountain said. I like developing an NPC that kind of has a routine, and if you watch them closely enough, like you'll see what they're doing. You'll see what they like to do with their day, and I think Elder Scrolls games are obviously really good at doing this. But yeah.
Okay. Teal, any thoughts on your end? I know that for you, NPC dialogue was always a big thing.
I always put a lot of emphasis on NPC dialogue and stage business, things that they were doing, because for me that's giving life to the world and giving credence to your story. What's happening to your main character or the party, it's not in a vacuum. And so the world needs to comment and react, and some people in the world aren't even aware of it. And, like the old man sitting on the bench complaining about his feet. Right. His feet hurt. Just things like that. I really enjoy and put a lot of focus into the NPCs in the world, and even the ones that, quote unquote, don't speak a lot. The stage business is very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What's happening around it, like you said, the stage business, to borrow the theatrical term, that is super important because, again, that world has to show that it lives outside of the player. It's okay for the player to be the most important thing, and whoever the player's controlling to be the most important person, to have that narrative spotlight shining on them. But light attenuates, and there's light around the concentration of that light beam. So that attenuation, that's a good way of thinking at it. What that light attenuates around the main subject has to contain something. You mentioned a background in film. Well, obviously, when you're filming something, what's behind the subject is just as important as the subject itself. Because not only it shows whether the subject blends into the background, but it also shows there's life outside the subject. Well, what's happening? So you can apply that to NPCs and background things happening. Like, if a building just exploded, make sure you have the firemen in the background trying to put out the fires, and a couple of search and rescue teams pulling people out, and some people may be approaching or unloading body bags. That adds a lot more life than just the character sitting there saying, "Oh, we're so lucky we got out before the bomb went off."
True, and another thing you can do is maybe there's that one fireman who's just kind of standing around not doing nothing as well.
Yeah.
And you get sort of multiple layers of background information, which can all really be fun to play with.
Like have that fireman sitting there with his hat off and he's just kind of rubbing his head, because he's just, have two people sitting around talking, like you're saying, they're not doing anything. Having a cop, just on his radio, things outside of that. But like with the guy sitting down rubbing his head, that's showing the emotion of, oh my God, I couldn't save them, something like that. People show emotion without a single word, so your NPCs should as well.
Yeah, and I do think that you can go a bit overboard with it. I have played a couple games where I feel like the games went a bit too overboard with it, and I both loved and hated it. With one of the ones I've talked about it before a lot on the Studio Blue chat, but it was Arcfinder Fantasia. I both loved and hated that game because they literally breathed so much life into NPCs is ridiculous. Like every time you ran into a mini boss, every time you went to a new dungeon, every time you fought a big boss someone had a big cutscene, every NPC, well, basically every NPC in every single town had something new to say. Sometimes it's just like, oh, like my day has just gone on, giving the sense of progression of time, which is something that gave me a sense that like, oh wow, time's actually moving when I'm playing through this game, which is something I don't experience a lot in RPGs, where it just feels like, oh, I saved the world in a day, because the NPCs just don't change. Arcrise gave me the sense of, I beat the fire cave and I went to the water cave. They don't have anything to say about the water cave. They're just like, oh, you know, today's a new day. And I was like, wow, I guess it took me a day to get there. And that's cool, but I feel like don't do that from the get-go, because you're going to burn yourself out unless you really know what you're doing. But man, that game had incredible moments because of it. One of my favorite moments is that, you know, a bit of a spoiler, is that there's like in the midpoint of the game, there's this one city that comes under attack by the evil empire and it gets blown up. But right before then, there's like an NPC, just this NPC, a child that runs up and down the street and just sings. And that's all that she does. But then after the city blows up, you don't find her anywhere. You see some parents on the side mourning, think they lost their child. But then you talk to some of the vendors around, and they mention, it's like, you know, it's strange. Around this time of day, I expect to hear music, and I don't know why. And that hit me hard. Like, all of a sudden, was I so invested in the heroes being like, let's go after the evil empire, than I ever had been before. The game didn't force that upon me. It didn't have me forced to talk to her when I walked into the city. It didn't force me to talk to the parents. It was just something that I discovered because I talked to every NPC.
That reminds me of the girl in the red dress in Schindler's List, which is by far one of the most impactful things I have ever seen in cinema. And it's a gut punch just right to the heart. So that's brilliantly done. That was
and then one of my other favorite ones that Arcrise Fantasia did is that there's one lady who's super busy at the marketplace. You keep talking to her, she's like, I'm busy, bother someone else. But if you talk to her enough times, she's like, well, clearly you're not busy. So can you please inform my husband, and yada yada. It was funny. Yeah. So
well, little moments like that matter. They do. You know, it takes a lot of work. Games take a lot of work.
Yeah, they do.
But it's worth it, because then that moment of fulfillment, like what you experienced, is so great. Teal, Arc, did you want to add to that at all?
I don't really have much to add. I mean, you pretty much covered everything.
Arc, anything?
I mean, what makes them special is that they are little and occasionally you'll get a memorable one. But there are so many little uncelebrated things in RPGs that have the scope to do it, that sort of add holistically to the experience, but you may not take away with you as a single experience, you know. So yeah,
they do add up. And you know, you think about it, oh, it's just this one character, I don't have to add that much. Oh, it's just one ... here, I could just make this guy just say ... or times are tough. But for every times are tough you have, you're losing out on those little things that add up to a truly rewarding and fulfilling experience for your players. Okay, we are nearing the end, so let's go and get some final thoughts here. We're going to start with Teal, then go to Key Mountain, and then to Arc, and just kind of give your final thoughts on the subject. Take a few minutes if you like, and that's how we'll wrap things up. So go ahead, Teal, go start off for you. Final thoughts.
I don't have any. We pass it on to Key Mountain.
Okay.
As I said, I'm not the big writer here. True. You know, the most I've done is all the NPC dialogue, but I was following your outlines in your script, so.
But you added a lot of life to those NPCs, and I think that's something that does need to be. People need to remember that those NPCs are so important.
Yeah, NPCs are important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Key Mountain.
Yeah, I mean, again, to build off
us with your words of wisdom that I certainly
oh, my land, help me. But yeah, I mean, to build off of that, like, of course, you know, NPCs are, of course, your whole world. Then to kind of touch on something we said earlier, is when it comes to difficulty, just be aware of, do you want to, make sure to tell your audience right up front, this is difficulty for the sake of difficulty or difficulty for the sake of storytelling. Like, is this a easy, hard, or normal mode just for difficulty, or are you doing Dark Souls? level of narrative where it's hard intentionally so that we can relate to the people who have given up, who have gone hollow. Because if you give up and you don't play Dark Souls again, you've gone hollow, just like the people of the world. So how do you utilize difficulty? How do you utilize your background is all part of your storytelling.
Absolutely.
My final thoughts is just that Key Mountain made me think I want to go back and look at my NPCs and add some singing children and stuff like that. I think after this I'm just gonna open the project real quick and just have a once over and see how they all go. I mean it's a mammoth topic. There's heaps of things to say about it. I always love talking about stories and story structure. I guess one thing we didn't really cover, which is worth noting, is that there is story, which is kind of your entire narrative, and then there's your main pillars of story. And it's arguable what those pillars are, but there are subcategories and subcategories and subcategories, and I think if you've got a handle on the different layers of your story, you can go into each layer, and it just makes things a little bit easier when you get it down to the micro level, and you put that sequence together, and then you pair it with the next sequence, and then you can kind of back out and see how it all fits together. And that's just the way that I find is easy, but it may not work for everyone.
Well, this is a mammoth topic, like you said, and it is one that will be multiple episodes of the Blue Room, because we've only, like level design last time, we have scratched only the surface. There's so much that goes into creating your game story. So we are going to be doing this topic again, obviously.
Oh, perfect.
Absolutely. But I want to give a thanks to Arcfinder, the creator of Eternal Remnant, to KeyMountainGamer, who is always helpful on the Studio Blue server, both writing and game development. And of course, Teal, the other half of Studio Blue, along with me, Teal. I do want to leave you guys with this. Writing, like everything, is both a skill and a craft. It takes a lot of time. Don't be discouraged. You're going to always create something that's going to make you go, was this good enough? And you're going to rework it. Stick with it, because eventually your masterpiece will be out there. I want to thank everybody who joined us for the Blue Room. I want to thank our audience. Do we want to give a quick shout out to the people who are on chat, Teal, who we can see?
Oh, well, the people I can see Bell Shell, Not Very Soft, Boo Boo Hotep, KV, Kingdom, Sarah, Raposo, Vonison, and let's scroll up here a little bit. Got Laufey, Mela, and I'm probably going to pronounce your name wrong, but Dossith?
Yeah, Dossith.
Dossith?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thank you guys for joining.
Thank you very much. Please join us tomorrow night on our Twitch channel for the Game Maker Forum, where Teal and I will go over more topics about game development fundamentals, and of course our AMA. We will be back next Wednesday with a new topic, some new panelists, and remember, if you like what you saw, lay the smack down the like button below, subscribe to our channel, consider supporting us on Patreon, connect with us over social media. We'll see you in the next video. Say goodnight, everyone.
Good night.